And all, and special thanks to the, looks like a couple hundred of you who are able to join us this afternoon. As I think all of you know, because you've seen the information, led you to this call, in the midst of the fighting last week, Rabbi Jacobs made the decision to go and represent our movement on the President's Conference Solidarity Mission to Israel. He left Tuesday. He flew back overnight last night, landing this morning. I have on good authority he went home and brushed his teeth and jumped in a train and headed down to the URJ office in Manhattan. We wanted to take the earliest possible opportunity for him to share with you some of his impressions from the trip, both from his meetings with Israeli governmental officials and his interaction with his colleagues on the President's Conference, and I think probably more importantly, and Rick will talk about this in a minute, his meetings with and visits with and discussion with the members of our Reform Jewish family over in Israel. As Adam said, I will be monitoring the questions log. If you have questions, feel free to type them in, depending on how we're doing on time. I'll try to pose a couple of them to Rabbi Jacobs before we're done. But in the spirit of time, let me get out of the way and introduce Rabbi Jacobs. Rick.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you really to all of you who've taken time on this Monday when people are getting back to all of our busy commitments after this Thanksgiving holiday weekend. I'll just share some of my impressions and some of the experience that I think really speaks to our work here in North America. First, this wasn't a planned trip. Last Sunday, as the news unfolded, it just became abundantly clear to me that I just needed to be in Israel. And people don't know what the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations is. It's a coordinating body of 52 national Jewish organizations from across the political and religious spectrums. And they have been very involved in some of the key issues of our day. And I would just point out that Rabbi Alexander Schindler was actually the chairman of the Conference of Presidents back in the 1970s and made a tremendous impact on American Jewish life through that role and obviously through his role at the UAHC. I wanted to say that there were a number of people on this trip, probably about 25 of us, who went on this solidarity mission. I particularly want to mention that Jerry Silverman was on the mission, and he is the head of the Jewish Federations of North America. That's the overarching body of all the federations in North America, as was Rabbi Steve Wernick, who is the head of United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, and Rabbi Steve Weil of the Orthodox Union. So in many ways, it was not just a group of organizational leaders, but we really had the streams of Jewish life in North America represented, and there was a real feeling of being a community and a representative body of the wider Jewish people here in North America. So there was a power to that. And I've been to Israel many times. One of the unusual things that I noticed is as we were entering Israeli airspace, we actually went into a holding pattern for 40 minutes. And honestly, in all the trips I've had, it's never happened before. And you may know that they had to reroute planes landing at Ben Gurion Airport because of the rocket fire in the south. So they had to take them on a more northern approach. And it just signaled what we all knew, which was this was not a calm moment in the life of our Jewish state. And when I was in the air, of course, the ceasefire had been discussed before we took off. It had not actually been concluded. And when we landed, as we were coming through passport control, I heard a person talking about a bus bombing that had taken place in Tel Aviv. And of course, for everybody, immediately it brought back all of the horrific and painful memories of the Second Intifada and the feeling that literally there was no safe place in Israeli society. And as horrible as that bus bombing was in Tel Aviv, it did not signal the beginning of a whole host of terrorist attacks throughout Israel. The rocket fire that was falling was certainly enough to cause the crisis and the military response. So when I arrived, it was the afternoon of Wednesday, and we went straight from the airport to Yafo. And in Yafo is a remarkable program of our movement. It's called the Mechinah. basically it's a group of 18-year-olds who have finished high school but have not yet started the Army. About 40% or so of them come from our movement. They are literally, our kids came through the Telem youth movement, grew up in our synagogues, and really have this deep connection. And others come to really experience the power of our movement through this. They live together in a kind of, feels like a, kind of kibbutz in the middle of Yafo, which is that beautiful area just south of Tel Aviv, which is old and historic and is a mixed neighborhood. There are Arab Israelis who live in Yafo as well as Jewish Israelis, and they live there. They cook their own food. They, they study together, and they do service work. Well, the day before, last Tuesday, they had all been in Beersheba, and as you know, Beersheba was part of the circle of danger for the rocket fire. That circle, by the way, over the last few years has grown wider. We know the name of Sderot, we know the names of some of the kibbutzim literally on the Gaza border, but what has happened in these recent weeks is that circle has grown wider to include, of course, Beersheba, but there were also rockets that reached South Tel Aviv and even the outskirts of Jerusalem, which really signaled a whole different moment in the evolution of this painful conflict. So I sat with some of the 52 Mechina participants, and I asked them to just describe what it was like to go down. They spent the day, and this was a time where they had to stop the bus because there were sirens, and they all had to get out quickly and lie down on the side of the road. So you listened, if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you listen through the radio to the sirens. So it was not a simple journey to get to Beersheba, and when they got there, they spent the day in bomb shelters, playing with kids who had been in those bomb shelters at that point for days on end. And one of the girls in the program said, they walked down into this first bomb shelter, and she said there was no air. You couldn't breathe. And she looked around, and of course the faces of these kids looked like they were not only scared, but they were, they were really tired and very, very worried. And with just the unfolding of games and just kids, the smiles returned. They still had to stay in the bomb shelter because in that area, if you were outside, you would have as much as 60 seconds to get to a shelter. And a lot of families just felt it was safer to keep the kids in the bomb shelters. Many families literally relocated for those days, and for some even for a couple of weeks, to the center and to the north of the country. So it was inspiring to hear our kids talk about what they needed to do, which was to go down and be of service, to live their values, to live their commitments, and to help out in the way that we do when our people are in need. From the Mechina in Yafo, we went to Beit Daniel, which is one of our very prominent Reform synagogues in the middle of Tel Aviv. And there, scheduled long before, was a meeting of the IMPJ, the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism. And they were very gracious and allowed me about 45 minutes to brief them, not only about this trip, but about some of the things that we are all working on together. So this allows me to tell you what I told them, which is we did something in this moment that, frankly, we had not done routinely, which is we decided as a Reform movement. We actually had a call with leaders from our movement last week, and we decided that this was a moment not for us to open our own emergency fund, but to join the Jewish Federations of North America's emergency fund with our colleagues in the conservative movement and in the Orthodox Union to make a statement that on behalf of North American Jewry, we were going not only to visit, but to help fund emergency relief. And those funds were committed to give literally very tangible help, food deliveries to elderly, transportation for kids outside of the affected area, trauma counseling, and special care for severely disabled people, activities for children who are in those shelters, hotlines for support and guidance, a whole host of things. And there was an initial allocation of $5 million that was allocated, and more money has come in. And if you go on to the URJ website, you are literally directed to this site so that we are able to raise funds for all the critical things. And, which I made very clear to IMPJ leadership, I want to make it clear to all of us on the call today, that we will also have a seat at the table for all of the allocations of this larger fund, including to the many, many specific things that our movement has been doing and will continue to do to reach out to help and support the people of the south of Israel. Rabbi Bennett Miller, who is the new president of ARTSA, is representing the whole movement, and he will be sitting on this allocations committee. They've already met once last week. They're going to meet again later this week, and they're going to set the priorities, and Rabbi Miller will make sure that all the things that our movement does every day, and especially in this time of crisis, will be able to be funded as well. We also discussed at the IMPJ board meeting the larger question of religious pluralism in Israel. Of course, we reflected on the continued activism in response to Anat Hoffman's arrest a month and a half ago, and to figure out what are the best strategies to move that forward, and to make sure we're all on the same page, because we're very concerned, of course, about what we're free to do at the Kotel, the Western Wall. But most importantly, we're trying to develop a strategy to really allow all of the streams, the non-Orthodox streams, to really live and flourish in Israel. And we're still in that process of creating a larger campaign. There's interest from the conservative movement, from the federations, to really develop a strategy and to make sure that we create that kind of ability to have a Reform rabbi do a wedding, which of course is now not officially allowed, a conservative rabbi, or even somebody who is from the Renewal or from one of the cultural groups, to really work on issues that shape the Jewish lives of all of the Jewish Israelis. After the IMPJ meeting, I had a meeting with a group of our post-college year students in a program called Tikkun Olam. And they are volunteers who spend a year volunteering in schools, teaching, in community centers in some very disadvantaged neighborhoods. I was sitting with these inspiring kids, one, Natanya Meyer, from one of our great congregations in Chicago, Temple Chai. She's a graduate of Asarui, and she just knew that spending this year in Israel doing Tikkun Olam is what she learned in her congregation, in her time at camp, and she wanted to live that value. As we were talking at 7:50, Noah Satef, who is the executive director of the Israel Religious Action Center, came in and said that they had finally agreed upon a ceasefire, and that ceasefire would take place at 9 p.m., about an hour later. But there was concern, of course, in the last hour before the ceasefire that might unleash a flurry of rockets, which it did not. And 9 o'clock that evening, I was driving back to Jerusalem with Danny Chin, who is a past president of Kol Neshama in Jerusalem and a member of the IMPJ board. And we listened to the radio the whole time in case there would be any alerts. He reminded me what we would do if there was such an alert. We would pull over to the side and we would lie down on the road on the side. Not only was there not an incident, but at 9 o'clock the ceasefire thankfully began, and the country took a side, not a complete side, because of course no one was certain how long it would last. Thursday morning we began with a briefing with Dr. Iran Lerman, who is one of Israel's top strategic analysts on issues facing the Middle East. So he gave us a couple of really important frameworks that I'll share. He said that in his mind, as a military analyst, Iron Dome, the new system that literally shot down many of the rockets that were launched in Gaza to cause harm and death and destruction in Israel, were shot down before they ever could do damage. He said this is actually a pivotal moment in the history of modern warfare. So he did it with batting averages. He said 860 is quite a batting average. That's roughly how many of the rockets were shot down. Again, they were shot down when they were headed towards populated areas, not when they were headed out to the middle of the desert. And we should all know that 1,500 rockets were fired since November 14th. less than 3% hit inhabited areas. That's an extraordinary statistic. Obviously, it doesn't give us complete security because we care deeply about those 3%, and there were deaths and serious injuries that were caused. But that Iron Dome really worked, and it was really a new kind of security for us. Doesn't give us complete security, but a great deal of protection. Iran Lerman also wanted to say that one of the things that was quite striking is that Israel had wider international support for this operation than any other in recent memory. And he really ascribed it to the Prime Minister, who really worked the phones, and they used social media to get their messages out. They didn't wait for CNN or all the newspapers to tell what was going on in this war. The Israelis really made sure in all of the media opportunities to get their messages out. So while we were in the south, we headed down first to Ashkelon, which is very, very close to the Gaza Strip, and they suffered quite a lot. And we made a stop at the hospital in Ashkelon and saw that they're building a whole new secure wing. Now, why do you need a secure wing in a hospital? Just think about what it means if you're literally in a hospital that could be hit by a rocket and you can't move patients, in 20 seconds. So we visited some of the patients, some of the soldiers, and some of the civilians who had been hurt. And we visited one man who works for the municipality, and he lost his leg. He was in ICU, and his wife was right by his side. And we offered a mishaberach, a prayer of healing, and he was very emotional. And the mayor of Ashkelon was with us, and he knew him by, not just by name. He knew the man who had been injured, and he said that he would be back, and he would have his job, and he would be a very important member of the society as he had been before. And it was, a very human face to the suffering that we all read about, but to actually see and talk with these families, and they were very appreciative of the visit. We headed over to Beersheba and saw some of the other challenges, and we met with the head of the very large hospital in Beersheba, and he showed us the map of all of their facilities. He said, we had to close the great majority of our operating rooms. We had people being brought in. We visited a soldier, a 19-year-old Golani soldier who had been hurt by shrapnel, and they'd done surgery on his leg. But the head of the hospital said we had to close the operating rooms because we can't do surgery in an unsecure operating room where we'd have to stop in the middle of the surgery and try to move someone to a sheltered area. So they were really trying to practice medicine in what was a very impossible situation. On Thursday night, I was asked on sort of a moment's notice, Gilad Kariv, the executive director of the Israel Movement, who's temporarily on leave as he actually is a candidate for the Knesset and the Labor Party, but he was contacted by a news show in Israel. It's called London and Kirschenbaum, two guys, a little bit like Charlie Rose, and they asked if I would be on the show that night. It's a live show, and he had read about some of the talks I'd given at the GA and wanted to interview me about religious pluralism in Israel in Hebrew, live stream. And Gilad said it's important. I said if it's important, I'm there. And some of these links are actually online for those who understand Hebrew, but it just shows that some of these issues really are finding their way to very, very mainstream media discussions. It doesn't mean we're solving them, but it means that a larger audience is caring more deeply about them. Friday morning, we met with General Yossi Kuperwasser, who is the Director General of Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And he's a soldier's soldier and a very smart, analytic mind. So he pointed out a couple of things that were important in his mind. He said, first of all, the U.S. role was absolutely critical, as well as the Egyptian role in the response. He said the Israeli goal was not to wipe out Hamas, but to restore deterrence and to minimize their offensive capabilities. And in that respect, he believes that the operation was successful. Yes, there are many people who say Israel should have continued and gone into a ground war, which would have been quite bloody and might have actually set back some of the larger security challenges like the threat of a nuclear Iran. So he said they achieved what they wanted to and were very careful to build international support and to make sure that they built the role for Egypt to make sure that it felt responsible for moderating some of the violence in Gaza. And clearly that was part of the puzzle that President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton were able to effect. On Friday morning, we also met with the Egyptian Consul General in Israel, Mustafa Gamila. So if you think about it, it's quite extraordinary. There's an Egyptian diplomatic official who's based in Tel Aviv. He came to us. This is also the day after Egypt's President Morsi had literally pulled in more political power to put himself above the judiciary. So I asked him a question about what did he think that meant for the Egyptian democracy, and he was very diplomatic and unable to answer that. But he did say to us that it was very important for the Egyptian government to maintain the peace treaty with Israel and to maintain relationships as well with their Arab brothers. We know that the Egyptian President Morsi is someone who's long associations with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they are very connected to Hamas. But it was clear that there is a strategic, an economic, and a political incentive for Egypt to play this role. We also met with Arnon Mantvert, who is the director of the JDC in Israel. They were the ones doing the most on-the-ground care for people in harm's way, trying to get handicapped people from the 7th floor of an apartment building to a bomb shelter, knowing that it was literally impossible to do it quickly, make sure that people were fed, that people were safe, and those that could, like children, would be literally bussed out of the area so that they could, for at least those few moments, be able to feel a sense of security. On Friday night, I was invited by the Israel movement to share Kabbalat Shabbat services with one of the newest congregations in our Israeli movement, and that is Congregation Yuval in Gedera, which is in the northern Negev. So they were very much in harm's way, not as close as Sderot, not as close as Shar HaNegev, but the families there had really been displaced. This Friday night was the first time they had come back together. You could just see the hugs, the kids, the joy of being back together. Some still felt a little bit tentative and didn't come to the service because they just felt that they'd been so traumatized by the days prior that they weren't yet ready to venture out. I have to give a special shout out to ARTSA, the leadership of ARTSA, Bennett Miller and Barbara Cavadias, to make sure that this Friday night service could be live streamed, and we saw hundreds of people across North America and around the world from our movement who participated and sent their prayers and love to our congregation. They gave me the honor of offering a few words of Devar Torah, and just so beautiful to see these young Israeli families so connected. Afterwards, I was talking to one young boy, about 9 years old, and he said, I wasn't afraid. And then we talked a little bit longer. He told me again that I wasn't afraid. My sisters were afraid. They're younger. Well, after you say that 3 times, you kind of have a sense that, of course, he was afraid, and how could he not be, and how could anyone living through that not have a sense of fear. But the Israeli spirit is quite resilient, and the beautiful way that the congregations care for one another. Our congregations in the middle of Israel opened their homes. Many literally had families come and stay with them for not a few days, but as long as a week and longer. So our movement knew exactly what to do, how to care for one another. It was really quite inspiring. Had a great Shabbat meal with Yaron Shavit, who is the Yoshev Rosh, the chairman of the Israel movement, and a fantastic leader of our movement. On Shabbat morning, I went to Kibbutz Tzuba, which is just outside of Jerusalem, to be with our EIE students. These are high school students who spend a semester studying in Israel, and they had 2 Tzeva Adom sirens that went off. These are code red sirens that suggest immediately you must find shelter. So they were a little bit traumatized, as you can imagine. There's actually a picture for those who are on the webinar. You can see their beautiful faces, and they led a great service. We had an interactive conversation for the Torah teaching. And of course, you think about the parsha, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva. Literally, Jacob left Beersheba. That's how the Torah portion started. And of course, he had to leave because he was afraid for his life. And of course, a couple of thousand years later, many people in Beersheba and the surrounding communities had to leave because they were afraid for their lives. So I talked to our EIE students about what did this mean to them? How did they get through this time, and what did they learn? And they talked about finding more inner reserves of strength that they didn't know they had to face some of the uncertainty and just the feeling of being vulnerable. They also talked about the power of their community and what a spectacular job our staff on the ground in Israel, Baruch Kraus and Rich Kirshen, and of course here, Paul Reichenbach and Miriam Chilton, just cared so beautifully for our kids and communicated so effectively with our parents. And you just have to be incredibly proud of those kids. In the afternoon, it's time to take a Shabbat nap, maybe have a little bit of a Shabbat seer, but the Israel movement had arranged for a trip to the south for me to literally go right to the Gaza border. So we went to Shar HaNegev, which is literally, a kilometer or two from the Gaza border. And we saw one of the only fortified schools in the country. Literally, every one of the buildings is fortified, so kids during school don't have to go running to a shelter. But interestingly, where the bus stop is, they have to put shelters, these concrete shelters, every 15 seconds along the way. So the campus is literally looking like a fortified area, and then all these shelters, because they have less than 15 seconds to find shelter because of their proximity to the Gaza Strip. And I met with the two leaders of our congregation in Shar HaNegev. They are just amazing, and they actually have the use of the beautiful auditorium on this fortified campus. So when they have their services, they are actually in a safe bomb shelter, and it's a beautiful space, and they have a growing community, quite inspiring. Then Chen Abraham, who works for the IMPJ, took me to her kibbutz, which is kibbutz Kfar Gaza, and it's literally, if you were Mariano Rivera, sorry for fans who aren't here in New York, you could throw a baseball pretty close to the Gaza border from where they are. And she shared an amazing story that during the middle of the rocket fire and the really scary time, she had to go back to her kibbutz, and she was driving along the road leading right up to the kibbutz, and there was a siren. So she stopped her car, which is what you're supposed to do, and there were a group of soldiers who were also stopped, and they were lying down on the side of the road as they're supposed to do, and she didn't lie down. She was standing up. So the soldiers said to her, what are you doing? You're supposed to lie down. And she said, I live here. You can see the rockets. So lying down makes sense. It's the right thing to do. But frankly, for those of us who've been living with these rockets for years, we are not accustomed to it, but we know how to keep our eyes on the, the horizon there, and we'll be able to see them. She took me in and showed me the kibbutz that had been pretty much abandoned during the heat of the fire, because they received mortar fire, which literally there's no siren, there's no alarm. It's just too quick, and the devastation to complete. So you got a really clear vision, and some of you saw some of those videos that I was able to take on my trip up on Facebook, and we'll be putting more up there. But Chen Abraham and her 13-year-old son, Or, have been living literally through the last decade in this rocket fire. And if anyone was unclear why Israel had to respond militarily, all you have to do is spend 2 minutes in this area and hear the stories of how impossible life had become. I would also suggest that one of the key things after the afternoon in the south, we had a dinner in Jerusalem with the senior staff of Israel's foreign ministry. These are the people who have to literally explain Israel to the world. And Gidon Meir is the Director General for Public Diplomacy. And I think he was correct to take credit for a whole new effectiveness that Israel's public diplomacy, that's actually the new name. We used to call it Hasbara, or kind of information sharing, but it's really a kind of diplomacy. And Israel was very proactive and very effective in getting the word out. And I have to say, even some of the videos, there was several videos that showed how many IDF bombing missions were aborted because of the discovery of civilians nearby. I believe that we have an important role, all of us on the call, and many of us are not on the call today, because we have to be able to get that word out and to help the foreign ministry make sure that the world, through media, through communal and community-wide discussions, understand that Israel was in a position that no country would have allowed. And they acted so unbelievably responsibly. On Sunday, we had briefings from Natan Sharansky, who's the head of the Jewish Agency, and we were actually scheduled to meet with the Prime Minister in the afternoon, but it turns out that Sunday was also, that's yesterday, Sunday was also the Likud primary for the upcoming elections. So the Prime Minister, many people say, well, he's a shoo-in, but that's not the case, and the Likud party is certainly concerned about how many seats they would be able to gain in the elections. So he was delayed, and instead we met in the cabinet room with Ron Dermer, who's one of his senior advisors, and General Yitzhak Amidror, who is the National Security Advisor. And they gave some really important frameworks. And I would just share that, for those people who attacked the Prime Minister for not going in and finishing the job, it's a very hard calculation, the General told us. But they really believe that they made not just a political decision, but a military decision, and a decision that will strengthen Israel's position facing later this year when Iran looms even larger, and the need to have international support and the need to have the world understanding, the kind of danger that Israelis live in and the kind of care and ethical clarity that the Israel military operates under. We also met with Stanley Fisher, who is the head of Israel's bank, chief economist, and he shared that the impact on the Israeli economy of this latest operation, Pillar of Defense, was not so great in the short term, but there are long-term challenges to Israel's economy. He made the point that a lot of times people in the media in the last week pointed out how expensive the Iron Dome rockets were, $50,000 per rocket. But he said when you calculate what those rockets saved in material and, more important, in human cost, they were very inexpensive and really brought a new sense of security. Last night, my last stop was to meet with students, HUC students in Jerusalem. Those are rabbinical, cantorial, and education students spending their first year in Israel studying and experiencing Israel up close and personal in ways that will shape their leadership and certainly shape their souls and their love for Israel, as well as Israeli rabbinic students came out last night, and they had really amazing insights about what this period of time has meant to them and how they are thinking about these issues. And they made some really good concrete suggestions. Many of them have served in our summer camps. Many of them have served as youth leaders in NIFTY, and they thought that it was really a critical moment for each of them to be communicating with social media, Facebook, and other things, as well as writing op-ed pieces in their local communities. These are really fantastic young people who are going to be really, really strong leaders, and I know they will not soon forget the sirens that went off and caused them to be like the other Israelis and live in the reality. But none of them were packing their bags. They feel very, very confident, committed to staying the course and making this a year that will be a cornerstone of their future leadership. But just a few concluding remarks. The takeaways for me: Israel's military, exceptional. Moral calculations made every single minute, and we've got to make that case. People are always saying that Israel's this very strong, aggressive, militarist state. Israel defended her people with such care and thought and ethical sensitivity. I'm incredibly proud, and I will say that publicly over and over again. I hope each of us can find our own way to do that. Let's remember, Gaza will not be permanently quiet. There's a long-term challenge there. Hamas, they're not nice people, and they're not at all reconciled to having Israel exist. and we've got long-term challenges there. But the Israeli military leaders, the generals that we spoke to, say that the Hamas military capacity has to be managed. It can't be eliminated at this point. They feel they're in a much better place. But also say, takeaway is we all need to be advocates for Israel, not just to listen to briefings and read newspapers, but to shape opinion in our congregations, in our communities, and I hope each of us will play that role. I want to say, most importantly, I left unbelievably proud of our Israeli Reform movement. Our lay leaders, our rabbis, educators, our members, are people of such depth and commitment. They live Tikkun Olam, they live a pluralistic, inclusive Judaism, and they are reshaping the face of modern Israel. It's clear to me that this has been a very scary and painful time for everybody who loves Israel. It's also time for us to figure out how we even more deeply embed Israel in our congregations and in our youth and in all of us. I would say that we're all a little bit too used to Israel as a narrative of Israel under siege. We want to make sure our Israel engagement isn't just at times of war and times of crisis, but in quiet times and in times of hope and in times even of prosperity, that we figure out ever new ways. That's a major focus of the URJ going forward. We'll be doing that with our partners in the movement, and I'm delighted and honored for all of you to be on this call today. I think probably went over a little bit. Let's maybe take a couple of questions before we all have to get back to all of our weekday tasks.
Sure, Rick. We've gotten a couple dozen questions. Let me try to pick one or two to ask before we run out of time. Cheryl Hooker writes and asks, our daughter is registered for EIE this spring. How concerned should we be about sending our 16-year-old to Israel at this time?
So you're asking me a question as the president of the Union for Reform Judaism, but you're also asking me a question as a dad. First of all, no one can make that decision for someone else, and no one can make that decision glibly. I would say that one of the things we learned is that we actually had someone join EIE for the spring who only registered in the last week. What I can tell you, and you can certainly hear it from one of the parents who was there all last week, that the staff is truly extraordinary. The way that they cared for the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being, they communicated quickly and regularly to parents and to the kids. I have complete confidence that they will do everything to make that semester a phenomenal semester. And I would say that we're having a number of calls for parents to get comfortable and to hear from other parents who literally have spent this last semester with their kids in this particular moment. So I think we want to help all of you, get as comfortable as you can, because we're comfortable as a movement. I think that we are regularly using the best practices for security every day. Whatever the kids are doing, we check with the Jewish Agency Security Department, and we vet everything we're going to do. So they lead these trips with such care and such concern. I think it is one of the most phenomenal programs that we offer in our movement, and I look forward to going to visit them during their great semester, second half of this year.
Rick, maybe this is a good one to wrap it up with. Gary Berman of Temple Judea says, Rabbi Jacobs, thank you for your leadership. As congregational leaders, what specific steps do you recommend we can take to further the URJ's work in this area?
So the first thing I would say is let's not assume that all of our members know the important details of this military operation. I assume people were following it with great concern. I'm confident of that. I'm also confident that there are concrete things to get out the word, maybe even to some of the churches in the community that have not been particularly understanding about Israel's real security risks and vulnerabilities, and to make sure that they understand that the Israeli military acted with such care. It's a time for financial contributions, and we're all part of this one fund that the Jewish Federations of North America opened with the conservative movement, the Reform movement, Orthodox participants, and I'd say there's still very much need for funds to help support and strengthen the communities in the South, and particularly to help the more disadvantaged communities that are struggling when there's a moment of quiet in the South as well as when there's a crisis. So I think it's a moment of leadership, and it's also a time for congregational leaders to talk about how does our congregation connect to Israel every day. I travel around. It's not every congregation in our movement that makes sure each week to offer prayer for the state of Israel, to figure out ways to help our youngest students in our early childhood centers begin to relate to Israel, to travel to Israel. Frankly, the question was asked a moment ago about EIE. I hope congregations that were planning to send groups in the coming months will send them, and they'll go and they'll see and they'll experience the joy, the beauty, and the incredible vitality of modern Israel. So I think it's a time to engage more deeply. It's a time to relate to Israel not as our vulnerable brothers and sisters alone, but as our partners in shaping an incredibly strong Jewish future by sharing all things we do in Jewish education and Jewish identity formation. There's just so much for all of us to hold close, and I hope that that will be our role going forward. And I pray as well, I know everybody on this call joins me in a prayer of peace for all those who live in Israel and, frankly, all those who live in the region. We had a Shabbat Shalom greeting that we said, of course, during this past Shabbat. And for some people in the South, it was the first time really they could say the word Shalom and have a sense of hope that it will be a time of quiet. But let us not only pray for peace, let us continue to work for peace, a peace that is not naive, but a peace that will one day come to that land. And there are enormous challenges. This Thursday, people know that the Palestinian Authority is going to bring to the United Nations unilateral declaration of status. They're going to join as a non-member state status. They'll likely be accepted. It's important for all of us to keep up with the news and to respond both thoughtfully and as part of a strong movement, which we are. So I would just say thank you all for your interest today, for sharing this time with me, and more importantly, for all the great work that we will do in the coming weeks and months. So thank you, and shalom.
Shalom, Rick. Thank you for your leadership and your time this afternoon. We've tried to answer your questions. I know that there are more pending. If folks want to follow up by email, you can send a note to presurj, P-R-E-S-U-R-J, at urj.org, and we'll try to get back to you as best we can. We've also asked, we have recorded this presentation. It will be posted on our website, and you can direct friends and family there to listen to it as well. For those who've asked about pictures and video, those are all going up on the URJ Facebook page, on the URJ YouTube channel, and other places as well. We're in the process of kind of rolling that stuff out right now. So again, thank you for your attention this afternoon. We look forward to continuing to be in touch on these important issues. Thank you.